Tom Kendrick is the current president of the OVA. He moved to Oakmont after having had a hugely successful career. He has held leadership positions with companies, universities, volunteer organizations, and professional societies. Tom spent 20 years with Hewlett-Packard and has over 40 years of management experience with HP, Visa, DuPont, and other companies. Tom retired in 2017 from his position as program director for UC Berkeley Extension, and he continues to teach business courses there. He's a published author who wrote Results Without Authority: How to Manage Complex Programs, as well as other business books. Tom has an MBA in finance from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, and he has engineering degrees from Princeton and the University of Pennsylvania. Tom is past president of the 2,500 member Silicon Valley chapter of Project Management Institute. He and his wife enjoy living in Oakmont. So Oakmont is very fortunate to benefit from Tom's leadership on the OVA Board of Directors. And we in Symposium are fortunate to hear your talk today. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Lynn. If I can get this set up properly. Looks like we're there. Good. So thank you for coming. We've got about 20 people here in the Burger Center, so thank you for coming out on a Sunday morning. We have a similar number, actually a few more than that on Zoom, and so I really appreciate your time. What I'd like to talk about today is a couple of projects, and as Lynn mentioned, I spent a lot of time talking about project management, both teaching at Berkeley and also the 10 or so years before I started teaching for Berkeley back 2 decades ago. I was doing workshops at Hewlett-Packard. In fact, one of my first introductions to Sonoma County when I first moved to California was a business trip up to Santa Rosa to the HP division that used to be up on Fountain Grove. It's where Keysight Technologies currently is. And one of the things I did with HP was workshops and helping project leaders become better project managers. And as you might imagine, project management, like many business topics, is pretty boring. So our goal whenever we do a workshop is to keep people's attention. And doing a workshop on project risk management, it occurred to me that one of the ways to get people more engaged was to tell a story. And the story that I hit on was the one that I'm going to share this morning. There's a book by David McCullough, and it's actually his first book. David McCullough, the very popular New York Times bestselling author. His first book was called The Path Between the Seas. And while I was reading that book, I realized that it was a perfect example of project risk management. Project risk management is about understanding what might go wrong, and the Panama Canal project was actually not one, but 2 projects. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. I wove the story of the Panama Canal into the workshops that I was doing. And one of the reasons that I did that was to get people back from breaks. It's really hard in a corporate environment to get people to come back after you let them go check their email, get a glass of water. We would begin those classes, not with this slide, but one that had this question on it. Apart from war, what was the most expensive project that was ever undertaken anywhere on the planet? And I always told them it was a big project of the 80s. And they would, of course, think it was the 1980s. And the answer, of course, was not the 1980s, it was the 1880s. There were 2 canal projects, one in the late 19th century that didn't go very well. I want to talk briefly about that, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the project that did actually succeed. In the early 1900s, the whole idea of the Panama Canal came back. And that was a project that actually succeeded in large measure because that was the birth of modern project management. That's when people started doing Gantt charts and project plans and building transcontinental railroads and skyscrapers, canals. And of course, one of the things that that brought with it was a discipline that helped people understand the work, helped them understand the risks, and avoided a lot of aggravation. So the question of the Panama Canal starts with where? Where are you going to build a canal? If you want to connect the Atlantic and the Pacific, Central America is a good place to start. And if you look at the map here, one of the things that you see is that there's one really, really skinny spot, and it's toward the bottom of this picture. It's that S curve that comes through where the country of Panama currently is. If you're going to build a canal, that's an obvious spot to start. And that's where, in fact, the canal today exists. The first project, as I said, didn't go very well. So they picked the right spot, but they didn't pick a good way to do the work. With project management, we want to set an objective. The objective that they set when they began in 1880 was they wanted to build a sea level canal, dig a giant trench to connect the Caribbean on the Atlantic side with the Pacific Ocean. They wanted to dig it at sea level to maximize the transit. They wanted to get through as fast as possible. It's about 50 miles, skinniest spot there in the Americas. They had budgeted about $60 million. That doesn't sound like a lot, but in 1880s, it was a pretty fair amount of money. They were going to take about a dozen years to build it. Their goal was to open the canal in 1892. The priorities for this project are reasonably predictable. The sea level canal was very important. This was a privately funded project. No governments were involved. It was private money that was going to build this canal. And so resources were the next priority. And this was the 1880s. It's not the internet era. Time was less important, but it was important. That was the most flexible. They wanted to finish in 1892, but if it had finished slightly after that, it would have been okay. So how did this project come to be? A fellow named Pierre de Lesseps was French. He was a fellow that had a real reputation for doing amazing things. He was called the Great Engineer because in 1869, some years before that, about a decade before the 1880s, he actually built the Suez Canal. Went down to Suez, dug the canal, opened it, also privately funded, and made a lot of people a lot of money. It was a huge, huge success, both from an operational and financial standpoint. He looked at that and he said, okay, what next? Spun the globe and said, all right, canal at Panama. That makes a lot of sense. Let's go build that. He estimated that it would save about $48 million a year in basically transit for people trying to move goods by sea between the Atlantic and the Pacific or vice versa. He estimated back of the envelope that it would cost about $100 million to build, and with a 2-year payback, that's a pretty good deal. So he said, that's my next project. That's what I'm going to do. But de Lesseps, despite his nickname, was not an engineer. He was a diplomat. He was a really persuasive guy, but he wasn't really good at detail. And of course, if you're going to run a really big project, that's not necessarily what you look for. He believed that he didn't have any shortcomings. He thought he could do anything. Well, Suez had sort of added a little bit of evidence to that, at least in his mind. And he was convinced he was infallible. He got into this project believing that this was going to be a massive success, much as they had been able to accomplish at Suez. And they were off and running. So it was a big project, as you can imagine, a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of people. There were investors because it was a privately funded project. There were a lot of legal advisors, people that had to negotiate contracts and treaties, a lot of expertise, technical expertise, engineering and whatnot. The governments of France, the US, and Colombia. There was no Panama in 1880. The area that we now know as Panama was part of the country of Colombia. So there was a lot of governmental work to do and a lot of PR. If you're going to run a big privately funded project, you need advertising people. So they got involved as well, a very large community of people. There was a meeting that they held in Paris, and the meeting was in 1879, just before this project got started. The meeting was called the International Congress to Study an Interoceanic Canal. And they got together, about 100 people got together. Some of them were technical, some of them were legal, some of them were governmental. They had a great meeting. De Lesseps led the meeting. He basically had everybody give their thoughts and make presentations. There were a number of presentations by the engineers that actually would have probably succeeded had they gone with those ideas. But de Lesseps wanted a sea level canal, and de Lesseps got a sea level canal. The engineers generally thought that that was a bad idea, but that was not the outcome of this meeting. And one question that often comes up when you talk about this project is, why France? Why was France involved at Suez? Why was France involved in Panama? And in the modern era, it's a good question because, of course, we don't really think of France as the hotbed of technology. But in the late 1800s, France was it. It's where you went to go study engineering. It's where Eiffel had just built his tower. It was the world center. It was the Silicon Valley of its day. So a project like this really could not have arisen anywhere else. So it was in the right place. It was about at the right time, but it wasn't necessarily the right project. Again, this is a map from the era showing some of the other things they looked at. There's a fairly large lake in Nicaragua toward the top of this picture. There was one plan to build a canal to connect the lake and then over into the Pacific. There were other ideas that came up. But again, the 50-mile transit across the Panama Strait was the target. It was just the obvious place to try to build a canal. So planning, well, did they do any? They did a little. De Lesseps raised some money. He went out to the investment community, he got some money, and he started the whole effort going. By the time he raised $60 million, though, that was his goal, he knew that that was going to be insufficient. His theory was, well, we'll raise that, we'll get started, need more, we'll go get more. And that's, again, not necessarily the best way to start a project like this. They didn't really think much about risk. They knew that there were technological challenges, but they figured, as has been true at Suez, the world was changing pretty quickly. There was a lot of new mechanical equipment. Electricity was becoming a thing. They figured that the technology they need would emerge before they actually needed it on the project. They didn't really give it a lot of thought beyond that. They didn't put a whole lot of effort into feasibility analysis either. One difference between Panama and Suez, Suez is a desert, sand. It was a maximum height of 25 feet of sand that they had to move to build a sea level canal at Suez. Well, Panama is part of the dividing line, the continental divide. There's one in North America, there's one in South America, there's one in Central America. The continental divide goes right through Central America, and in the middle of Panama, it rises to 400 feet. Panama is not a desert, it's a tropical rainforest. The soils in Panama are these gluey, viscous, flowing clay that you might imagine would be in a tropical rainforest. And digging the 9 miles that was about 400 feet above sea level was completely unprecedented. Nobody had ever even contemplated doing anything of that magnitude. They were only going to spend about a third of the $60 million they raised actually doing the digging. The rest of the money, advertising. They were going to build support and enthusiasm worldwide for the canal because, of course, they wanted it to be a success. When it opened, they wanted a lot of business. The biggest problem they had was the tropics. In the tropics in the late 1800s, malaria, yellow fever, very serious disease problems. And of course, that was going to be an issue that they'd have to deal with as they move forward with this project. And then a rainforest, well, there's a lot of rain. We're hoping to get some later today. If you get a lot of rain, you get flooding. If you're building a sea level canal, the flooding all goes to the low point. What's the low point? Well, if you're digging a sea level canal, it's the canal. And so the rivers that were there, the flooding that was inevitable was going to be a huge challenge as well. So they had a lot of barriers to get over as they started moving forward with this project. So one 3-letter acronym that you run into a lot, businesses are full of TLAs, 3-letter acronym WBS, a work breakdown structure, is one of the foundations of project management. And the question you can ask is, did they do one? Did they break the work down, understand what they were getting into? They did a reasonably good job in this first portion to set up the canal, talked about the meeting that they'd held. Building interest, well, they spent a lot of money on it. They also did some other things. De Lesseps went to Panama. And de Lesseps was, as I say, a diplomat. He was Mr. Party. Mr. Party came to town and built enthusiasm in Panama like you can't believe. He was all over the place. And then he went to New York because, of course, where was the money going to come from to build a canal? Who benefits from a canal at Panama? Well, the US went to New York. And again, more parties. And at the end of all this, he went back to France. Everybody in the entire world was just completely jazzed about this project. It was going to be the greatest thing ever. Came back to France. Now, the rest of this picture, you'd expect it would get filled out. Raising the money, they did basically some of that. They knew they needed more than they'd raised. Surveys. Eventually, they sent some engineers to Panama to actually look at what the work was going to look like. But they hadn't done that. And dig the canal. Yeah, we'll get around to that. So all of the beginning had earmarks of trouble. So what happened with this canal? The first year, the engineers got on site. They looked around and they said, you know, that meeting we held last year where we said this wasn't a great idea, it's really not a great idea. They said this is going to take longer, it's going to cost more. And that was absorbed back in Paris, but they didn't do anything about it. They didn't raise any more money. They didn't tell anybody about it. They just noted that that was true. These were tough people back in the 1880s. They had lots of trouble with diseases, with flooding. A lot of the people that came to Panama to dig the canal contracted malaria, yellow fever, other diseases. Many of them died of those diseases before they were actually even accounted for. One of the statistics that's really interesting about this project when you research it is nobody knows how many people died digging the Panama Canal, because a lot of the folks that were on site, they'd come to do it, just really never were, they weren't visible in the statistics. Flooding was a problem. The equipment they had was really inadequate to the task that they were facing. So they really had huge challenges. They kept going though. And by 1885, this is about 4 or 5 years into the project, they did go back to the investors and they said, look, we're going to need more money. Project's going okay, but we're not going to finish it with the original investment. The money quadrupled. Now they're up to $250 million, starting to get to real money even these days. They got the money and they announced at the time, well, 1892, maybe not, we'll get it done, trust us. And so they kept going, they kept working. And again, a couple of years went by and they needed yet more money. They went back to the investors predictably said, no, you know, you've got our money. You've got all you're going to get. I don't want to throw good money after bad. So they needed more money. they went to the banks and they borrowed it. So they borrowed money. They got up to about $1/3 of $1 billion. And they changed the design. And I'll talk about locks in a minute, but it's no longer a sea level canal. The challenge of digging a 400-foot deep trench was just so overwhelming that they realized that they were going to have a stair-step mechanism, a series of locks to bring the ships inland and then down through the stair-step lock system on the other side. So they changed the design, they got more money, they kept going, and that continued yet for another couple of years. And they got to the point where the banks wouldn't loan them any more money, the investors were done, they really had no way forward. And so the entire effort collapsed. When the company went bankrupt, the company in Paris that was doing this project, de Lesseps was still in charge, and he was not very well thought of at that point, as you might imagine. Now, that's not the end of the story. By 1891, the press had taken over, and there were lots of stories in all the newspapers, this was worldwide, but certainly in France, a lot of scandal, a lot of money that didn't go where it should have gone, stories that should have been visible weren't. People went to jail. And one of the other things that happened was the French government fell. Now, the French governments fell a lot in this era, but this is the only one that I'm aware of that happened because of an engineering project failure. The government actually fell in 1891 in France because of this. So what happens after a project? You look back on it. If you spend a minute and talk about this project, they spent more than 10 years, massive amount of time. A lot of money was spent, well over 300 million. The estimates for loss of life are somewhere north of 25,000. No one knows for sure. It's at least 20,000. Very, very expensive effort in terms of human life. They had accomplished a good deal in terms of excavation, but they didn't have anything that looked anything like a canal. This is a picture of what's left of some of the excavation that was done back in the 1880s when they were digging inland from the Caribbean side. They did have one massive accomplishment. They had essentially proven that you cannot build a sea level canal at Panama. And what about our leader? How did our leader do? Well, not good at progress judgment. Some people debate as to whether he was misinformed or whether he was dishonest, but all through this, right till the end, he was telling people things were going just fine. He had a lot of faith in technology and medicine that did not appear. So that was one of the things that he counted on that didn't really break his way. Not long after this, he died a broken man, and he died in poverty. If he'd never taken on Panama, he would still be known as the great engineer, the guy that built the Suez Canal. So be careful what you take on. So about 10 years went by, and the idea of a canal at Panama never really went away. Still a good idea. And the phrase that's on the slide here, a man, a plan, a canal, Panama, it's a palindrome, reads the same backward, forward. The man in that palindrome is Teddy Roosevelt. So what happens in the early 1900s is the idea of Panama resurfaces. It resurfaces not as a commercial project, but as a government project. Because one of the things that was true in the 1800s and into the early 1900s is the US had two navies, had an Atlantic Navy, had a Pacific Navy. Needed two navies because we have two coasts, and you can't get back and forth, certainly not in any reasonable time frame. So Teddy Roosevelt says, I'm tired of paying for two navies. Let's build a canal at Panama, and we have one navy. Save us a lot of money. So this project reemerges in the early 1900s as a US government project. Teddy Roosevelt, this was a strategic military venture. He was fond of the phrase bully, so I used it here. He bullied the people in Congress into approving this project. He twisted some arms. He got people to approve it. He didn't like dealing with Bogota. As I said, the area where this canal was being built by the French was part of Colombia. And Teddy Roosevelt didn't like the Colombians. So he sent some gunboats down to Panama City on the Pacific side and some other gunboats down to Colón on the Caribbean. And without ever firing a shot, suddenly there was a brand new independent Central American country. The country of Panama came into being through what they call gunboat diplomacy. And so as you can see from that, US foreign policy hasn't really changed that much over the years. He did buy the routes, the remaining equipment and the rights and the contracts that the French had left behind. That was part of this deal, getting the project up and running again. But that was sort of where they went. Now, much more of a traditional sponsor of a project, Teddy Roosevelt. He left the engineering and the technology to the people who were the subject matter experts. So that was one big change. De Lesseps had been very involved, probably should not have been. Teddy Roosevelt had other things to do. He was, after all, president of the US. So who was involved in all of this? Well, there was a succession of managers, and this project didn't actually start that much better than the French project ended, because of course, same era, same ideas. The first manager of the project, a fellow named John Wallace, who was there for about a year. I've got him labeled here the dreamer. He was the guy that got things rolling again. He was a big project guy. He was a railroad manager. He had built some railroads across the US. He was a very good manager, but he really didn't know a lot about canals. That wasn't his expertise. And he didn't have a lot of authority. There was a committee that he had to report to. And so after about a year, he didn't like the weather in Panama much either. He decided that he was going to quit. And he was replaced by John Stevens. John Stevens actually was also a railroad guy, but he was a railroad guy that actually built railroads, not managed them. Stevens had been one of the main architects of the railroad coming across the US and going into the Pacific Northwest to Portland and Seattle. He went down to Panama and he basically put the plans together. So he's labeled here as the planner. Hung around for a little longer than Wallace, but he also didn't stay. He was replaced ultimately by a third manager, George Goethals. And George Goethals was the digger. He's the guy that got it done. And I'll talk mostly about Stevens and Wallace in the rest of this talk. But those two guys really were the two heavy lifters. They got the project underway and they got it actually completed. There was a fourth player. One of the biggest problems of building a canal in the tropics is the disease problem. And so Dr. Gorgas was the fourth big player in making sure that this was a successful project. Dr. Gorgas had been on the island of Cuba when Walter Reed discovered what was causing the problem with yellow fever, mosquitoes. Gorgas actually had contracted yellow fever, recovered, and was very, very knowledgeable in how to avoid mosquito-borne tropical disease. And so he was given a lot of latitude and a lot of money to manage that for the American project in the early 1900s. So lots of leaders, lots of roles, key players. Teddy Roosevelt has a quote that's on this slide that you've probably seen before. Far better it is to dare mighty things, win glorious triumphs, and so forth, than to live in the gray twilight that knows victory nor defeat. Now, most project leaders are fine with that gray twilight. We like doing things, we like getting them done. We don't like massive challenges. People who run for president like massive challenges. So we needed to turn this project into something that was a lot more doable, a lot more realistic, a lot more practical. And the method for that was applying the tools of modern project management that, as I said, had been emerging through this period. There was a fellow named Fred Taylor, who was the stopwatch expert that did all the modern management techniques. One of his associates was Henry Gantt. And if you're at all familiar with project management, you've probably seen a Gantt chart. Henry Gantt did all of those with rulers and straight edges. He invented that technique. That was also a product of this era, the early 1900s. Henry Gantt never fired up Microsoft project once in his whole life, but he invented the Gantt chart. So they had an objective here that was not really that different than what the French had stated. A couple of significant shifts. One was it's a lock and dam canal. It's not at sea level anymore. And they were going to do it a little quicker, not because the French had done so much work already, but because there really was better technology. This is, again, a couple decades on. They had some tools that the French didn't have available to them. Similar overall investment to what the French ultimately had spent. About $375 million was budgeted for this project, and I'll come back to that number in a minute. So the planning. Well, the first year they spent a big chunk of their budget. Again, part of it was paying off and getting the contracts and the treaties and whatnot that were in place still from the French era, but didn't have a real good plan. Wallace resigned. That first year was really not a pretty picture. When Stevens came in as the second manager, the first thing he did was he said, look, let's figure this out. He gave a lot of money to Dr. Gorgas. He spent a lot of time and effort planning for the work. Lots of questions, lots of pulling together the data. The quote from Stevens at the bottom of this slide is one I've always liked. I'll prepare well regardless of criticism. Future will show the wisdom of this policy, and indeed it did. The plan that they ultimately used was essentially what Stevens had put in place during his tenure as the leader of this project. They spent a lot of time, unlike the French, looking at the question of risk. What are some of the risks? Well, Stevens said there were really three diseases at Panama. There's yellow fever and malaria, and those he gave to Dr. Gorgas. The third disease is cold feet. People were really not sure this could be done. First project failed spectacularly. We need to convince people that you can do something in order to get them to be motivated to even try. And so one of his biggest objectives was to get people to feel that this not only was a good project, it was a doable project. So Gorgas got to work on malaria, yellow fever. Very few people died of either disease during the American project because they did a great job managing all of that. And Stevens was the cure for the other. He really sat down and figured it out. What he wanted to do was to break the project up. I mentioned the idea of a work breakdown structure. He pulled all of the massive, hugely complicated project, pulled it apart into pieces that people could think about, put inside their brains, feel were going to be doable. When he got to the point where the work looked feasible, people would roll up their sleeves and off they'd go. The quote at the bottom here is from Stevens. What made the quote canal exceptional was its scale. There's a lot to do. This is, again, bigger than almost anything that had ever been done anywhere on the planet. But Stevens said there's really no element of mystery involved here. The problem is magnitude, not miracles. We can deal with magnitude. Miracles, not so much. So there were constraints. One of the things that was kind of interesting, it had a lot of railroad people on this project. The US had built canals, but not very big ones. But we built big railroads. So pulling these people in who knew big projects was really kind of smart on Roosevelt's part. Railroad engineering was also one of the techniques that made a big, big difference. One of Stevens' accomplishments was he built essentially a conveyor belt that was a big circle of track with flat cars being pulled around in a circle, so that as the excavation proceeded, they could dump all of the soil that was being dug out onto a flat car, It could be moved around to where it was needed. Again, they were building these big dams. And with things that looked like snow shovels, they could rake the dirt off the flat cars and put it where it belonged as the dam and just keep this loop going. Now, of course, the digging would proceed, it would move. They had to be able to move track in order to keep this conveyor belt moving. And one of the things that Stevens invented was a way to move track. And he invented a way that 12 people could move a mile of track a day. If you've ever watched people building railroads, that's pretty amazing. It would take about 600 people using conventional techniques to do this. And they had machinery for just shifting the track a little bit at a time so that the conveyor belt could stay where they needed it to be. I mentioned that Wallace didn't like the weather in Panama. Stevens didn't really either. It's hot, steamy, not a very nice place to live, certainly in the wet summer sticky months. So after Stevens had a good plan and things were starting to move, he also quit. And well, Teddy Roosevelt was getting a little tired of this. His first manager quits, the second manager quits. He wants that canal. That's part of his legacy. So when Stevens quit, he had all this stuff going. And Roosevelt said, you know, I want a guy in there that actually knows something about building a canal. And I also want a guy that can't quit. So he said, after Stevens resigned in 1907, I'm going to pull a guy in here that can get the job done. George Washington Goethals was not only a really good choice for this project, he'd been on the short list both other times, but he had one other thing going for him in Roosevelt's mind. He was a major, soon to be a colonel, in the Army Corps of Engineers. And that what that meant was, although Wallace could quit and Stevens could quit, well, you know, Goethals really couldn't quit unless he wanted to be court-martialed. So Roosevelt had his guy. So Goethals moves in and takes the project over. Goethals did a lot of pretty modern stuff. Again, this is the early 1900s. Some of the things that Goethals did would be easily recognizable by people running big projects today. He had a lot of information that was in the canal record. It was kind of like the Oakmont News of the canal project. It had a lot of names. It had a lot of statistics. It helped people to see their name in the paper and to see that they were accomplishing good stuff. And of course, that built enthusiasm for the project. He met with people who had questions. He would talk to anybody. And that was, again, a little unusual in the era. On Sunday mornings, people could queue up. Sometimes as many as 100 people would queue up to ask questions and talk with him. And he had lots of time and he always listened. That also built a lot of loyalty and a lot of enthusiasm. And he recognized and rewarded service. One of the things they did was they stamped out little service medals that people could wear based on how long they'd been working on the project. And they used the medal from all the equipment that the French had left behind in the 1880s to stamp out these medals. There's a TV show where they interview a guy from some years ago, but he was 102 years old. This guy who worked on the Panama Canal, he's being interviewed on this TV show. He's wearing a little sport coat and he's still got his medal. It's on his lapel. So it really made a big difference. The other thing that was kind of interesting about this was our sponsor showed up. So this was before Stevens left. Teddy Roosevelt goes to Panama. And there's a famous picture of him there, of him up on one of the giant steam shovels that was going to be used for excavation in his white suit, operating the steam shovel. But that was a pretty big deal. People working on the canal were very impressed that Roosevelt had come down, and the press all went with him. It was a double win, both because it built a lot of enthusiasm on site, people doing the work, that the president would come see the project. But when the press got back to the US, one of the things they wrote was that although a US president had never left the country while serving in office, that this visit was such a success that one of these days, an American president might even visit Europe. Could happen. So how do they deal with the problems? Well, disease I talked about already. They spent a lot of time and effort and money on it. In fact, a lot of the ideas and the things they did on the Panama Canal project really set the standard worldwide for dealing with tropical disease anywhere. One of the other problems that they had that they were trying to deal with was digging 400 feet. Well, it's not quite 400, it's about 300 because they were going to build these dams and they only had to come up about 100 feet in the lock system. But they did have to dig. And when you're digging in the environment, the soil that they were digging through, mudslides were a really serious problem. And they just had to keep going. The cut, and you can see here, this is a picture that I took of the actual geometry of the area that was narrowest in the middle of Panama. It really is quite impressive that they were able to get the trench that they needed, the 300-foot deep trench in the middle of Panama, excavated properly. The idea of having seagoing vessels coming through a lock system was unprecedented. Locks have been around for a long time, but mostly they're on rivers. And of course, the boats that navigate rivers are not that big. These are seagoing vessels. The scale of the lock system that was necessary at Panama was completely unprecedented. They really needed to be able to build these giant concrete bathtubs that the boats sail into and use as a stair step to get up and down. They needed to build those in a way that would be very, very robust and durable. And how'd they deal with that? Well, as an engineer, it's what we often do. You over-engineer it. After more than 100 years of use, the locks at the Panama Canal have minor cracks here and there. They're still holding up just fine. Thank you very much. They did a great job on that. The lock mechanisms, the scale here meant that what normally happened with locks, they normally operate, open, close the doors and whatnot. They use animals. In this era, you had mules. Mules were basically aligned with every canal that had ever been built. That's how you open, close the doors. That's how you open, close the valves. Most of what they did at Panama, they couldn't do with mules. They had to do it with electricity. They had to use electric motors that were becoming available. And as they built this, they were inventing new technology. And inventing new technology was something that we do a lot on big projects. But this was an interesting case because Goethals went out and he said, I don't know how to do this. I'm going to find a company that does. He found a company in New York that he thought could help out with this. And he basically pulled them in. And he said, I want you to be my partner here. I want you to figure out how to get these massive doors open and closed on the locks. And although they weren't well known at the beginning of this project, by the end of the project, most everybody around the world had heard of the General Electric Company. They got the big contract in Panama and invented a lot of the technology that's still in use today to actually operate the locks that are in place there. Outside experts here, Goethals and the Army Corps of Engineers working with GE, a lot of people trace the beginning of the military industrial complex to that decision. And it certainly worked out for the project there. The last risk that they ran was the one that they didn't handle all that well. They had a lot of digging to do. They had trees they had to move. They had rocks that had to be basically removed, a lot of dynamite. And of course, there was a lot of loss of life building the project that actually succeeded, but not from disease. A lot of people were injured handling explosives. They did the best they could, but dynamite is dynamite. So one of the other things that happened with this was that the US Senate, very similar in the early 1900s to the Senate that we have today, not the brightest people in the world. They decided that they were going to basically say, yeah, we think this canal is a good idea, but we like the sea level canal idea. So they were going to pass a bill that said that the canal would have to be at sea level. And although Stevens had more important things to do, he got on a boat, went back to Washington, and he had to deal with this. He had to basically deal with the fact that they really could not, the French had proven, build a sea level canal. So when Stevens got to Washington, he spent a lot of time working with people in Congress. He talked to a lot of people. He got a lot of statistics together. He built his engineering case to say that this isn't something that we can actually do. The smartest thing, though, he did was he wrote a speech that was delivered on the floor of the Senate by a senator from Pennsylvania, Senator Knox. Is a wonderful name for a senator. His name was Philander Knox. He gave this speech, and he gave the speech because, of course, senator from Pennsylvania, he hailed from Pittsburgh. If you build a sea level canal, what don't you need? Well, you don't need those big honking steel doors. You don't need all those engines. You don't need all the motors. You don't need nearly as much technology. And so Senator Knox gave a great speech. And, you know, there were still 31 pinheads in the Senate that voted against a sea level canal. But of course, there were enough that voted for the lock and dam design that they actually were able to move forward with it. So no project ever proceeds exactly the way it's begun. We always have adjustments as we go. Mudslides I mentioned, when Goethals had a big cave in, his standard response, hell, dig it out again. They just kept at it. They're still doing it to keep the canal open. They dredge constantly because, of course, the mud is still sloughing down into the channel. As the ships got bigger, they realized that they were going to have to enlarge the locks from the even massive size they'd begun with. They widened the cut to 300 feet, the trench they were digging in the middle of Panama. And the locks went to 110 feet wide and 1,000 feet long. These are really, really, really big concrete bathtubs. When they decided that the canal could be bigger, both wider for transit and bigger locks for moving the ships up and down, that basically locked in a design. The Panamax freighter is a square bottomed boat. I'll have a picture of one in a minute. That basically is 110 feet wide and 1,000 feet long. And it's the biggest thing that can go through the locks at the Panama Canal as it was built back more than a century ago. They had multiple doors, so they didn't have to use quite so much water. Smaller ships could lock through without wasting quite so much water. It's all gravity fed. And they moved the Pacific locks further inland. One of the things that was happening in the world in the early 1900s was the political situation was getting a lot more unstable. And as the threat of war started to creep more inevitably into view, they decided that having locks that you could see from the Pacific Ocean, not a good idea. You can lob some bombs into that. They moved them further inland, and that there were actually good engineering reasons for that as well. But everything had to be written down. They scrupulously controlled the changes, and they made the ones that made sense. So ultimately, they completed the canal. They got it built. On August 15th, the first ship went from the Atlantic to the Pacific, came in from the Caribbean side, exited into the Pacific Ocean, and it was a pretty big deal. Nothing like this had ever happened before. The 50-mile lock and dam canal was done, and something like 25 to 30,000 people had died building it, but there it was. It was opened 6 months ahead of schedule. It was actually opened under budget. One of the things that was quite remarkable about the project is that by planning it carefully and laying out the work, also making some changes that saved some money along the way, they were able to actually achieve an objective that was significantly better than their original goal. And so this might have been the very first and maybe last government project to end under budget and ahead of schedule. Most of the credit goes to Goethals. He was there throughout the building of the canal from about 1907 onward through its opening, and he stayed on after it opened and managed it for a number of years. He's a really interesting figure. There's a bridge outside New York that's named after him. He's known for many things, but this was probably his crowning achievement. He is a good example of a person who's famous for being an engineer. We know of a lot of engineers, but most engineers we know of are business people or multi-bazillionaires or something. Goethals is famous for being an engineer. Here's the lock in the Panama Canal. I talked about this for years and years. I'd never seen it. 10 years ago, I took a Rhodes Scholar trip and spent about 4 days doing all the stuff Rhodes Scholar does, taking you inside the canal, next to the canal, and over the canal, and you name it. Fascinating experience. And you can see here the walls are a little pockmarked. After more than 100 years of use, they've been banged up a little bit, but they're basically all still there. Here's a map of what it kind of looks like. In the middle of Panama, in the middle of the canal, you have this island. It used to be a hilltop. It's now a bird sanctuary. Much of the transit is this big lake in the middle of Panama. And there are dams on both ends that hold the water in. The narrow transit that I've mentioned a couple times, the cut, is here close to the Pacific. Most of the steepest area is much closer to the Pacific side of Panama on the south edge of this picture. And it's not stood still. So there's still a lot going on. The canal was further widened not long after it was opened in order to let ships go through more quickly. There was a dam that had to be built. One of the things you saw in this picture, here on the right side of the picture, there's a lake. And there's a dam, Madden Dam, that was built uphill from the canal. All of this is gravity fed. So as you lock ships through, the water to fill the locks comes from above. And then it's basically all goes out to the Caribbean or the Pacific Ocean, depending on which side you're on. Operating a canal in the drier part of the year, and they'd run out of water. And you can't bring ships through. So they built a dam in the 30s in order to operate the canal year round. They decided that they were going to build a set of larger locks in the 40s, and that never got started because World War II was in the way. But in the meantime, it continued to operate. In 1999, the canal was turned over to Panama. It was owned and operated by the US. There's a 10-mile strip in the middle of Panama that was US territory. It's where Senator John McCain was actually born. Turned over to Panama. So now the canal zone isn't the canal zone anymore. It's just part of Panama. In 2005, the country decided that that third transit was a pretty good idea. Bigger ships want to be able to bring more traffic through. So they started planning on it, and it's actually now open. It was bigger locks. They were going to be twice as wide, 40% longer, much larger tankers than the 1,000-foot constriction that's been there for more than 100 years, and much deeper, so that again, much more traffic could come through. The picture that's on the bottom of this slide shows a little bit of how those new locks operate. This is going out into the Caribbean. Top of the picture, you can see the existing locks. They're right next to each other. There are 3 locks that bring you up from the Caribbean or back down to the Caribbean. And what the picture in the lower right-hand side of the screen here shows is that the locks are much bigger, and they have these giant holding pens. All 3 locks have big areas where the water can be shuffled. And by moving water in and out from these holding pens, they can save a lot of it. The larger locks are going to drain all the water they had available much too quickly. And so by using these holding pins, they're able to operate these much larger locks continuously. So now there are 3 transits and things are much, much better. They were planning to open it for the centennial in 2014. And as with many projects, well, didn't quite work out that way, but they were able to open it in 2016. And the costs were much above their budget, but I don't think anybody in Panama thought it was a bad idea. So the book I mentioned, David McCullough's book, is absolutely worth reading. It's a great story. And I worked the story into the book that I did on project risk management, because like dragging people back from breaks on project workshops, it's useful to have something at the end of the chapter that isn't quite so boring as project management. And that's the 3rd edition of that book. And I keep updating the Panama story as they build new stuff. And this is a pair of fairly typical boats going through the existing locks. Most of the traffic through Panama is now containerized. And you can see one ship that's basically with the lock filled, and the ship next to it on the lower part of the screen is a ship of similar size that's in a lock that's empty, or not empty, but lowered. And watching this is absolutely fascinating. I had a dinner at this Rhodes Scholar trip where it was an overlook looking at the ships coming through the canal. And my wife, Barbara, had to drag me away to have me eat something because it was just too fascinating not to watch. It's an excellent, excellent trip, and it's worth seeing. So we have time for a few questions. I was supposed to take about 40 minutes, 45, and I took more like 50. So here we are.
So we're going to open it to questions
Thank you.
alternating. Yes, thank you, Tom. Alternating a question from the Burger and then a question on Zoom and back to Burger, et cetera.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. We just came back from a trip that started in Paris and ended up in Switzerland on the Moselle and Rhine rivers. We must have gone through 25 locks on the way. Woke me up every night as we did it. 2 things. I'm not an engineer. I couldn't get my mind wrapped around. We've got to be climbing an elevation from Paris to the Alps, but we kept dropping down in the canal each time we went through a canal. They didn't raise it. We were going down 20, 30 feet maybe sometime. And I know that the Alps are the beginning of the water for all the waters of Rhine Rhone. And then I was thinking about the Panama Canal. Does that mean that the Atlantic Ocean and Pacific Ocean are different heights? And that didn't make sense because aren't oceans the same height anywhere in the world? Then I got to thinking maybe it's just the elevation of the land that needed this thing. So maybe you can help me understand.
Good. It's a great question. Actually, because of the geometry of Panama, the fact that the Caribbean entrance is actually north of the Pacific entrance, there's a slight difference in sea level, but that's not why the locks are there. The locks are there because they have built dams on both ends, creating that massive lake. Most of the 50-mile transit is about mostly 40 miles of lake in the middle. And the locks are to bring you up to the lake, which is about 100 feet above sea level on both sides. So each lock brings a ship up about 30 feet. You need 3 of them to come in, and then you sail across the lake. And then on the other side, you have stair stepping down through a set of 3 locks that bring you back down 30 feet to sea level. And that meant that they did not have to dig down to the 400 feet that the French basically were bamboozled by. But any system where there's a change in elevation, where you have ships that have to negotiate it, you tend to have a system of locks where the ship sails in, the door closes behind it, the water goes up, the doors on the other end go open, and then the ship can sail out into the different depth water on the other side, and vice versa. You can sail in from the other side, drop the water. And of course, the way the mechanics of a lock operate, you're always moving the water from uphill to downhill. It's all gravity fed. And when you run out of water, you can't run the locks anymore.
George,
Great question.
we can't hear you, George.
Peggy, you had a question.
Yes, I did. Where did they bury the 25,000 people that died? And also, where's the toll gate? How do these big ships pay to go through? Are they based on height or width or weight?
Both great questions. There are a lot of graveyards. If you visit Panama, there are a lot of cemeteries that are built there. There's a very impressive French cemetery, as you would imagine, because of the first project. A lot of the loss of life was there, and people were buried there. And I'm not the perfect person to ask that question. I know that some people were returned to their countries to be buried. Certainly some of the key players, the higher paid people, probably were sent back to their homelands. But it is a country that really all countries have lots of cemeteries, but some are dedicated to the people who lost their lives here. The question of tolls is interesting. The toll going through the Panama Canal is based on weight. And so if you pick a big boat through, you pay a fee. And as you come into the first lock, there's paperwork that has to be filled out, and the payment is part of that. The lowest toll that was ever paid was by the adventurer Richard Halliburton, who swam the 50 miles of the Panama Canal. They locked him through, and he paid a toll based on weight of 50 cents. That was, I think, back in the 60s. And I'm probably wrong on that, but it's relatively modern.
Okay, we have another burger question.
Howdy, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
You mentioned it's mostly container cargo ships now. I'm wondering, are there recreational, cruise ships that go through, and how long does it take?
Typical transit through the canal, it's 50 miles. It takes a couple hours to go through the 3 locks on each side. And then depending on how quickly it goes through the Gatun Lake, but you can get through during one day. The ship that I took was a relatively small boat. It was about an 80-foot wooden craft that was way smaller than the locks. So we went through with other boats. There was a sailboat that went through some of the locks that we were on. The boat that we were on was actually reputed to be Al Capone's boat from way back in the day. But it took about, we left in the morning, we got to the other side. We started at Panama City, we got to the other side early afternoon. So it's a matter of hours to transit the canal.
George?
Tom, we all have a concern about climate change and the effect on many different things. Somehow the idea of the big canal right down at the ocean level brings that to mind.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts to share?
I'm often asked the question, what would it cost to build the canal today? And I think that if you were really contemplating basically flooding and getting rid of that much tropical rainforest, probably be a non-starter. Building the additional locks didn't really flood any additional land. This is the sort of project, China had one, the Three Gorges Dam, that they got a lot of criticism for. So this really is a project of an earlier era, I think. this sort of engineering effort we could do. We could probably do it much more quickly and easily than was true a century ago. But I do think this is really the kind of project that we would have a very tough time even beginning to justify.
Maybe you answered the question I have. There was some discussion of building another canal through, I think it was Guatemala. What is the status of that proposal?
I know that people debate that endlessly, and of course you could build a canal almost anywhere, but I think the economics of a canal in Guatemala are, at least for the present, back underwater, literally.
George?
We're okay at this end.
Just a historical anecdote. The two of the founders of Santa Rosa, Heyman and Hone, got off their boat. They came from Baltimore in Panama City, walked across those 60 miles, and then just picked up another ship, and it saved them lots of time.
Mhm.
It did take them 10 days, though, to walk from one end to the other.
Well, one of the stories in McCullough's book is that about 3 decades before the French effort began in the mid 1800s, they decided they were going to build a railroad across Panama for exactly that reason. So people could sail through the Caribbean, come in to Cologne there on the Caribbean coast, and then take a railroad across to the other side, pick up a ship, and then come up to California. Many, many people did. That was a fairly standard transit for people who were coming to California for the gold rush. A lot of stories about people who came by way of Panama. The building of the railroad was a similar story to the French Canal project. It took way longer, cost a lot more. They were able to open it, but it was a massive engineering challenge building a 50-mile railroad across where the canal would ultimately be built.
So I'm interested in the development of the country of Panama
Mhm.
and the gunboat policy. So how did the US get the people of Colombia to agree that we're going to have a new country? And did the US install the government?
I'd have to reread that part of the book to come up with specific details, but Colombia really didn't get a vote. In essence, the US engaged some rabble rousers who were in that part of the country in the Isthmus of Panama area, and they became the government of Panama. They basically declared independence. And again, without firing a shot, the people in Colombia said, okay, not worth fighting a war over, getting involved in the US. So they basically gave up the rights to that portion of what had been their country for many, many years at that point.
Tom, are there a lot of tugboats that position the ships because they could do a lot of damage if they were trying to get the right thing?
Yes, there are. And there are tugboats that bring the ships in. The people who run the boats, the captains of the boats that come in, you have people who come on board and actually take responsibility for the transit of the boat at minimum through the locks. And one question that's come up is, of course, we're all really aware of the boat that went sideways at Suez. And could the Panama Canal be closed similarly? One of the differences, of course, is that the Suez Canal is sea level. And when the ship got sideways, there was really nothing much they could do about it. But the tugboats and all of the geometry of the Panama Canal, to my understanding, makes that kind of misadventure much more likely, much more unlikely.
And I guess you said that, but they already have people whose regular job is to move the ships through.
Yeah, they have people that come on and pilot the boats through. That's part of what you pay the fee for.
Any more questions? George, I think you had an announcement. We
You're-
can't hear you,
You're
George.
muted, George.
On behalf of the Zoom participants, a big thank you for a great presentation. Those of you have been noticing, I hope, that we have been using closed captioning today. And if you have any questions on that, please feel free to email us or in some other way let us know so we can improve it. We do intend to continue to use closed captioning. Back to you, Lynn.